I don't know if I can explain what happened that winter in the mountains, but I know I'll never forget it. I've thought about it for years, trying to make sense of it. Maybe writing it down will help. It was 2013. I was 34 at the time, working construction jobs whenever they came up, trying to keep my head above water. A buddy of mine, Dale, offered me a week's work helping him fix up an old cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The owner had inherited it from a relative who died and wanted it fixed up before selling. The place was in rough shape, half-rotted floors, busted windows, and a chimney that was ready to collapse. The job paid well, and I needed the money. Dale and I had worked together before, and he was a solid guy, so I agreed. He told me it'd just be the two of us out there, maybe 3 if his cousin could make it. That was fine by me. I didn't mind the solitude. We packed up our tools and supplies and drove out early on a Monday morning. The cabin was remote, far from the nearest town. The last hour of the drive was nothing but winding dirt roads through thick pine forest. No houses, no cell service, just trees stretching in every direction. When we arrived, the place looked worse than I expected. The roof sagged, the porch had holes big enough to snap an ankle, and the air smelled like damp wood and decay. The owner had left a stack of lumber and some supplies, but we had our work cut out for us. We spent the first day hauling debris out of the cabin and clearing the place up. It was slow work, and by nightfall we were exhausted. We had set up cots inside since the nearest motel was hours away. The cabin had no electricity, so we used lanterns and a propane heater to keep warm. That first night was cold. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the walls. I woke up a few times to strange noises, branches snapping, movement outside, but I chalked it up to wildlife. Probably deer or raccoons rummaging through the debris we left outside. The next morning, we got to work early. I started on the porch while Dale tackled the chimney. We barely spoke, both of us focused on getting as much done as possible. Around midday, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the dirt near the tree line. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They weren't ours. We had boots on, and these were barefoot. They were fresh, too. I called Dale over. He frowned, staring at the prints. Probably just some hiker passing through, he muttered. I wanted to believe that, but we were miles from any trail, and the idea of someone wandering barefoot in the cold didn't sit right with me. We let it go and got back to work, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, quieter, like something was watching us. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Around midnight, I heard movement outside again. This time, it wasn't just branches breaking. It was slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding. I didn't want to wake Dale unless I had to, so I just listened. The footsteps stopped for a while, then started again, closer this time. I finally nudged Dale awake. "You hear that?" I whispered. He grunted, barely opening his eyes. "Animals." Then he rolled over and went back to sleep. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I found more footprints outside, this time closer to the cabin. They circled around it like whoever it was had been watching us for a long time. We didn't talk about it. We just kept working, but I could tell Dale was uneasy too. We barely took breaks, pushing through the day just to keep our minds off it. By the fourth night, things got worse. I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. Light, rhythmic taps, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the window, barely breathing. The tapping stopped. Then came the footsteps again, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I turned my head slightly, trying to see Dale in the dim light. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, his hand resting near his tool belt where he kept a hammer. Neither of us spoke. Then something outside let out a low, wheezing breath. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. My whole body locked up. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but I was afraid to move. Then came a whisper, a low, rasping voice just outside the window. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like my name. That was it. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam shot through the cabin, hitting the window. Nothing was there. Dale was already up, grabbing his coat. "We're leaving," he muttered. We packed up in minutes. We didn't care about the tools or the supplies. We just wanted to get out. As we stepped outside, the woods were dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them surrounding the cabin. Not just footprints, handprints too. Some pressed against the wood, some trailing along the windows, as if something had been touching the cabin, watching us. We didn't say a word. We just got in the truck and drove. I don't remember the drive back. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. Neither of us spoke about it again. The owner of the cabin called us a few weeks later, asking why we never finished the job. We didn't tell him the truth. We just made up some excuse about scheduling conflicts. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. I never liked hunting alone, but sometimes you don't have a choice. It was late October, and the weather was colder than usual for that time of year. I had planned the trip with my brother and a couple of friends, but one by one, they all dropped out: work, family, last-minute excuses. I almost backed out too, but the thought of spending a weekend in the quiet, away from everything, was too tempting. The cabin was an old hunting lodge my grandfather had built back in the 1960s, deep in the Maine woods. My dad and I used to go there every season when I was younger, but over the years we stopped coming as often. It had been almost 10 years since I'd last been there, and from what I heard, it was still standing but in rough shape. The drive took most of the day. I had to take a long stretch of dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years, potholes and loose gravel making it a slow and careful trip. The trees stretched high on either side, dense and unmoving. There was no cell service this far out, and that was fine. I wanted the quiet. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just as I remembered: small, sturdy, and weather-worn. The wood was grayer than before, and the roof sagged slightly at the edges. The front porch creaked under my weight, but the door still held strong. The old padlock rusted but intact. I unlocked it, stepping inside to a rush of stale, cold air. The inside was simple: one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a sleeping area in the back. There were still old supplies on the shelves: cans of beans, coffee, even a few bottles of water left over from years ago. I set down my bags, unpacked my rifle, and got to work cleaning up. Dust covered everything, and a few mouse droppings in the corners told me I wasn't the only one who had used the place. After getting a fire going in the stove, I checked the rifle and my gear. I had brought enough food for a few days, but my goal was to hunt something, maybe a deer if I was lucky. The sun was already getting low by the time I finished, the light outside turning deep orange. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line. It was silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. That wasn't unusual, but something about it unsettled me. Usually, you could hear the occasional crack of a branch, maybe the distant sound of an animal moving through the brush. But here, there was only stillness. That night, I ate a quick meal, read a few pages from an old book I had brought, and turned in early. The bed was just an old cot, uncomfortable and stiff, but it would do. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something felt off. The steps weren't quick or random. They were steady, almost like someone was walking, pausing, then stepping again. I sat up, reaching for my rifle, careful not to make any noise. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving the room dark and cold. I waited, listening, trying to place the direction of the sound. It was near the tree line, maybe 20 or 30 yards away. Then it stopped. I held my breath. Minutes passed. Nothing. Finally, I let out a slow exhale, setting the rifle back down. Probably just an animal. Maybe my nerves were getting the better of me. I lay back down, closing my eyes. The next morning, I found tracks near the cabin. They weren't deer tracks. They were human. Boot prints, deep in the soft dirt, leading from the trees toward the cabin, then circling around it. I felt my stomach tighten. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the only people who knew about this cabin were family. My brother hadn't mentioned coming out here, and I hadn't told anyone else about my trip. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they disappeared into the brush. Whoever it was, they had walked in a strange, looping pattern around the cabin before heading back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. I could pack up and leave, but a part of me didn't want to. Could have been some lost hiker, someone passing through. But why walk around the cabin like that? Why come so close and not knock or make themselves known? I decided to stay. I spent the day hunting, hiking deeper into the woods. I set up in a clearing, rifle ready, scanning for movement. Hours passed, and I saw nothing. No deer, no tracks, not even birds flying overhead. It was like everything had left this place. As the sun dipped low, I started back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something. A shape standing just inside the tree line, far enough away that I couldn't make out details. It wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the branches. My stomach clenched. I raised my rifle slightly, not aiming, just holding it steady. The figure didn't move. I took a slow step forward, and as I did, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever. The sun was setting fast, and I didn't want to be out here in the dark. I forced myself to move, to keep walking back toward the cabin, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was open. I had locked it. I knew I had. The inside was the same as I had left it. Nothing was taken, nothing was moved except for one thing. My backpack. It was open, dumped out on the floor. Someone had been inside. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair near the wood stove, rifle in my lap, waiting. Every noise made my pulse spike. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they came right up to the porch. I raised the rifle, heart pounding. The steps stopped. Then, slow and deliberate, the door handle rattled. I didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, waiting, breath shallow, finger on the trigger. Then, without a sound, the footsteps retreated. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't try to track the prints. I didn't look back. I drove straight to town, heart still hammering. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for anything at all. But trouble has a way of finding you when you least expect it. The trip had been planned for weeks. Just me, some solitude, and a cabin deep in the woods. No phone calls, no emails, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackle of a fire at night. I had rented the place from an old man in town, a retired logger who barely spoke. He gave me the keys, took the cash, and pointed me in the right direction. The drive took nearly 2 hours, mostly on dirt roads that wound through thick forest. The cabin itself was small, old, but sturdy. A single room with a wood-burning stove, a simple bed, and a table with 2 chairs. A few old hunting trophies lined the walls. Dusty deer heads and a rusted trap that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It was perfect. The first night was peaceful. I sat outside, watching the sky go dark, listening to the night sounds. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance. Insects buzzed. The forest was alive, but in a quiet, patient way. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but that changed the next day. I woke early, made some coffee on the stove, and decided to go for a walk. The woods were thick, untouched. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in years of fallen leaves and moss. It felt like I was walking through a world that had been left behind by time. After an hour, I found a clearing with a small creek running through it. I bent down, splashing my face with cold water, breathing in the fresh air. That's when I saw it. Deep in the trees, half hidden by branches. A cabin. Not mine. Someone else's. It looked abandoned. The wood was gray and weathered. The roof sagged slightly. No smoke from the chimney. No lights. No sign of life. I should have left, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, feeling my heartbeat pick up. Something about the place didn't feel right. The door was closed, but the lock was broken, hanging loose. The windows were grimy, the glass cracked in places. I pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked loud enough to make me flinch. Inside, dust floated in the air. The furniture was sparse. An old table, a single chair, a small bed pushed against the wall. But what caught my eye was the smell. Something had rotted here. The floorboards near the bed were dark, stained. I stepped closer, my footstep echoing in the silent room. That's when I saw it. A boot. Not just any boot. Police boot. It was old, but it had the distinct markings of law enforcement gear. And it wasn't alone. A uniform jacket was crumpled in the corner, dusty but unmistakable. Panic started to creep in. Had a cop lived here? Was this some kind of hunting cabin? Why was there blood on the floor? I backed out slowly, heart pounding, every nerve in my body telling me to leave. I turned, stepping outside, breathing deep. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. Then I heard it. A car. I froze, my body tensing. The sound of tires on gravel, coming from the direction of my cabin. I hurried back, keeping low, moving quickly but quietly. As I neared the trees surrounding my cabin, I saw it. A black SUV, parked just outside. A man stood next to it, his back to me. He was wearing a police uniform. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at my cabin, his hands resting on his belt. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't recognize him, but something about him felt wrong. He wasn't here for a friendly visit. I stayed hidden, watching. He finally moved, stepping toward the cabin, opening the door without hesitation. He went inside. I had 2 choices, run or wait, but something told me running wouldn't help. Minutes passed. Then he stepped back out, closing the door behind him. His expression was unreadable. Slowly he turned, scanning the woods, and then he called out my name. A cold wave of fear washed over me. He knew I was here. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he spoke again. Low, calm, like he wasn't in a hurry. I know what you found. The words sent ice through my veins. I had never seen this man before in my life, but he knew I had been in that other cabin. I stayed completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. He waited a moment longer, then turned and walked back to his SUV. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting. I needed a plan. I crept back through the trees, keeping low. I had to get out of here. My truck was parked next to the cabin, but there was no way I was making it without him seeing. The sun was setting, shadows stretching through the woods. My only chance was to wait until dark. An hour passed, then another. The sky turned black. I moved slowly, carefully, keeping my steps light on the forest floor. Then I heard the door to the SUV open. Footsteps. He was moving. I froze behind a tree, barely breathing. Then I saw him, standing just feet away, flashlight in hand. And in the other hand, a gun. He wasn't looking for a conversation. I stayed as still as possible, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then, without warning, he fired a shot into the trees. A warning? Or was he just trying to scare me out? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard him crashing through the trees. I reached the creek, my boots splashing through the water. The terrain was rough, slowing me down. Then, another shot. Closer this time. I kept running. Ahead, I saw something, a cabin. Not mine. Not the abandoned one. Another one. I had no choice. I ran straight for it, throwing myself against the door, forcing it open. Inside, dust. Silence. I turned, slamming the door shut. There was no lock. Nothing to keep him out. I backed away, breathing hard. Then headlights. Through the grimy window, I saw the SUV roll to a stop just outside. A long pause. Then the door opened. Boots on gravel. A shadow stretched across the ground. He knew I was inside. A moment of silence. Then he spoke. "You should have stayed away." My blood ran cold. The handle turned. The door creaked open. And I knew this was it. I grabbed the only thing within reach, an old fireplace poker. Rusted. Heavy. The door swung open. I swung hard. The impact sent a shock through my arms. He staggered back, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. I didn't wait. I ran past him, out into the night, my legs burning with effort. Behind me, a gunshot rang out. Bark exploded from a tree inches from my head. But I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst. And then I saw it. A road. Headlights in the distance. I stumbled forward, waving my arms, collapsing as the car screeched to a stop. The driver was a local, a hunter heading back to town. He helped me up, his face full of confusion and fear. I looked back. The woods were silent. No sign of the cop. No sign of the SUV. He was gone. But I knew I had only just survived. And I had no idea who else knew what I had found. I never planned to be out there that long. I had been working on a small hunting cabin deep in the woods, a simple one-room place where I could stay during the season. I wasn't building anything fancy, just a sturdy structure with a slanted roof for walls and a wood-burning stove for heat. It was supposed to be a quiet, straightforward project, something to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. The land belonged to an old friend of mine, a guy I had known since I was a teenager. He had a few acres out here, mostly untouched forest, and he had no problem letting me clear a small section to build. It wasn't easy getting the materials out here. I had to make multiple trips in my truck, carrying lumber, tools, and everything else I needed. I kept it all stacked under a tarp near the site, trying to keep it dry between workdays. That evening, I had only planned to do a little work, just enough to get the main frame up. The forecast had called for light rain, but nothing heavy. I had my rain gear, a flashlight, and my truck parked a few hundred feet away on an old logging road. I figured I'd work a few hours, then head back home before the rain picked up. The place was isolated. No one came out here unless they had a reason. It was miles from the nearest house and even farther from the closest town. No cell service, no traffic, no people. Just woods stretching in every direction. It was quiet, except for the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. I started working just before sunset, hammering the first boards into place. I moved quickly, wanting to get as much done as I could before the rain got worse. The air was thick and damp, the kind of heavy humidity that comes before a storm. The first drops started falling around an hour in, a light drizzle at first, then steady rainfall. I pulled up my hood and kept working. By the time I had the frame up, the rain was coming down harder. I checked my watch. It was getting late, later than I had planned to stay. But I told myself I could get just a little more done. Just a few more nails. Just a few more boards. I don't know when I first noticed it. Maybe it was a sound, something faint beneath the hammering rain. Maybe it was just a feeling, that sensation you get when something isn't right. I stopped working and listened. The rain pattered against the leaves, against my tarp-covered pile of supplies, against the half-built cabin. The wind was picking up, making the trees creak and sway. But there was something else, a noise that didn't belong. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the rain, illuminating the wet ground, the trunks of the trees, the edge of my worksite. Nothing, just the woods. I stood there for a long moment, rain dripping off my hood, my breath coming slow and steady. Then I shook it off and went back to work. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had been out here alone for too long. The rain, the isolation, it was making me jumpy. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept catching myself glancing toward the tree line, my ears straining to hear something over the storm. A part of me wanted to pack up and leave, get in my truck and drive out of there, come back in the morning. But another part of me, the stubborn part, told me I was being ridiculous. I forced myself to focus, nail after nail, board after board. The sound of my hammer echoed through the clearing. The wind howled, and then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine, not an animal, someone walking. I froze, my heart pounding. My flashlight was still sitting on a stack of wood beside me, its beam pointing off into the dark. I reached for it slowly, my fingers wrapping around the handle. I turned it toward the sound. The rain made it hard to see, but I could just make out something moving at the edge of the trees. A shape, just barely visible through the curtain of rain. Person. They were standing still, just watching. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't supposed to be out here alone. No one was. There was no reason for someone else to be this deep in the woods, especially not in the middle of a storm. I didn't move, didn't say anything, just kept my light fixed on them. Then they took a step back, then another, and then they disappeared into the trees. I waited, holding my breath, my hands gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. I listened, but the footsteps were gone. I don't know how long I stood there. A minute, maybe 5. The rain kept falling. The trees kept swaying. Everything else was silent. I should have left right then. Should have grabbed my keys and driven home as fast as I could. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to believe what I had seen. Maybe I thought I had imagined it. Or maybe I just didn't want to leave my work unfinished. I turned back to the cabin and forced myself to keep going. But I worked faster. Every nail, every board, I moved like I was on borrowed time. My flashlight stayed close, my eyes flicking toward the tree line every few seconds. The feeling never went away. I knew they were still out there, watching. By the time I finished, the rain was coming down so hard it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I grabbed my tools, threw them into my bag, and headed for my truck. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I forced myself to walk, slow and steady, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. When I reached my truck, I yanked the door open and climbed inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights came on, illuminating the wet road ahead. The trees, the rain. And for just a moment, just a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the light, tall, still, watching. I slammed the truck into gear and got the hell out of there. I didn't go back the next day. Didn't go back the day after that either. When I finally did return a week later, the cabin was still there. My tools were still there. Nothing was missing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that someone had been watching me, and maybe, just maybe, they still were. I had never been the kind of person to go off into the wilderness alone, but that year, something about getting away from everything felt right. I needed it. The stress of work, the constant city noise, and the never-ending cycle of waking up, working, and sleeping had worn me down. I wanted silence. I wanted solitude. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind through the trees. I found a listing online for a cabin in the Ozark Mountains. It was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived, deep into the forest with no neighbors in sight. That was what I wanted. No traffic, no people, just me and the quiet. The drive itself was long but peaceful. The highways eventually turned into winding back roads, and those roads became gravel paths. My truck kicked up dust as I drove deeper into the woods, my tires crunching over fallen leaves and small stones. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from old logs with a dark green metal roof. A wraparound porch overlooked a clearing that sloped down into the woods. There was a fire pit, a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin, and an old outhouse a short walk away. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like wood and age, but not in a bad way. There was a simple setup, a small kitchen, a table, a couch, and a fireplace. A single bedroom was tucked in the back with a twin-sized bed. No television, no internet, no distractions. Exactly what I needed. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking, gathering some firewood, and making myself something to eat. By the time darkness settled over the trees, I was sitting outside in a worn wooden chair, watching the flames flicker in the fire pit. The night air was cool, crisp, and filled with the sounds of nature. I could hear insects chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the branches. But as I sat there, I started to notice something else, something off. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't. It was a sound distant, faint, but unmistakably there. A slow, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I turned my head toward the tree line, squinting into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the sound continued. It wasn't constant. It would stop for a while, then start again, always in a different place. I wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily, but something about the way the footsteps moved, pausing and shifting positions, made my skin crawl. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was out there. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a hiker had wandered too close. Maybe a deer was moving through the underbrush in an odd pattern. Either way, I wasn't about to let my imagination get the better of me. I stood up, stretched, and put out the fire before heading inside. Locking the door behind me, I checked the windows, making sure they were shut. I crawled into bed and told myself it was nothing, just my nerves. But I didn't sleep well. The night was too quiet. At some point, I realized the insects had stopped chirping, and the owls had gone silent. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the unnatural stillness outside. And then, somewhere near the cabin, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I forced myself to stay still, my body tensed. The steps circled the cabin, stopping every so often, as if whoever was out there was listening, waiting. Then came the worst part, the soft creak of the porch. Someone was standing just outside the door. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. The wood creaked again, shifting under the weight of unseen feet. I reached for the knife I had brought, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. Minutes passed. The sounds eventually faded. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to move, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, I stepped outside, knife still in hand. The porch was empty, but there were tracks, shoe prints, deep and clear in the dirt, leading around the cabin. I wasn't alone out here. The thought made my stomach turn. I had come here for peace, for solitude, but now all I wanted was to leave. I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. My hands were shaking as I threw my bag into the truck and started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled away. I drove faster than I should have, barely slowing down for the winding roads. I just wanted to get out, to be somewhere with people, somewhere with cell service. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I finally took a breath. I grabbed my phone and checked my messages. My reception was back. My hands were still unsteady as I opened the cabin rental site, scrolling to find the listing so I could report what happened. But the listing was gone. I checked my email, looking for my booking confirmation. It wasn't there. It was like the cabin had never existed. I sat there, my mind racing. I had been there. I had the key, the memories, the fear still crawling under my skin. But according to the website, the place didn't exist. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know why the cabin vanished from the listing. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back into the woods alone again. It started with a phone call early in the morning. My boss needed me to check out an old property his company had recently acquired, a remote cabin deep in the woods. The land had been abandoned for years, and they needed someone to inspect it, make sure it was still structurally sound, and report back. I was used to doing odd jobs like this, but something about this one didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he rushed through the details, almost as if he was trying to get me off the phone. It wasn't until later that I learned why. The cabin was located in a part of the state that had been mostly forgotten. Old logging roads led to it, barely maintained, overgrown with weeds and lined with trees that had swallowed up whatever remained of human presence. The last recorded owner had disappeared years ago, and there were no clear records of what had happened to him. The land had been passed around between different owners, eventually landing in the hands of the company I worked for. The drive took hours. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No gas stations, no houses, no other cars. Just miles of trees, dirt roads, and the occasional rusted-out vehicle that had been left behind to rot. The sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that made everything feel colder than it actually was. By the time I reached the property, I already felt uneasy. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, surrounded by trees that looked like they had been trying to reclaim the structure for years. The wood was old, warped from years of exposure to the elements. The roof sagged in places, the windows were boarded up, and the front door looked like it had been forced open before. There were no signs of animals or even birds, just an eerie, unnatural silence. I parked the truck a few yards away and got out, scanning the area. The ground was uneven, covered in dead leaves, patches of moss, and old tire tracks that had long since faded. The air smelled damp, like rotting wood and earth. I had a bad feeling about the place. Still, I had a job to do. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the cabin. The front steps groaned under my weight as I climbed them, the wood brittle beneath my boots. I reached for the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open with a low, drawn-out creak. The inside was worse than I expected. Dust coated every surface, thick enough to suggest that no one had set foot inside for years. The furniture was still there, An old wooden table, a few chairs, a rusted-out stove in the corner, but everything was covered in dirt and cobwebs. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the kind that might have been yellow once but had since faded to a sickly brown. The smell inside was worse than outside. Stale air mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place. I stepped further in, shining my flashlight around. The floor felt unstable in places, the wood soft from years of neglect. There were old papers scattered across the table, faded and unreadable. A single cup sat on the counter, coated in dust, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Then I heard it, a sound from deeper inside the cabin, a dull, dragging noise. I froze, my grip tightening on the flashlight. It was probably an animal, I told myself, a raccoon or a possum, maybe even a stray dog that had taken shelter inside. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate movement, not an animal. I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway at the back of the cabin led to 2 rooms. One of the doors was slightly open. I could see a sliver of darkness beyond it. I took a step forward, then another. The smell grew stronger. I reached the door and pushed it open the rest of the way. The room was empty. A single bed sat against the wall, the mattress torn and stained. A small dresser stood in the corner, one of the drawers half open. The window was covered in grime, barely letting any light through. The air was thick, suffocating. I scanned the room, my pulse still racing. Nothing, no signs of anyone. But then the closet door. It was slightly ajar, a thin, dark gap. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had it been like that before? I took a step closer, reached out, pulled it open. Nothing. Just old coats hanging from a rusted rod, their fabric stiff with age. A few pairs of shoes lined up neatly on the floor, untouched by time. I let out a slow breath. Maybe I was overthinking things. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. The marks on the floor, deep scratches in the wood, leading from the closet to the bed, like something had been dragged. I stared at them, my stomach twisting into knots. Something wasn't right. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The walls felt like they were closing in. The silence felt heavier, pressing against my skin. I needed to get out. I turned and walked out of the room, my boots making the floor creak with every step. Then I heard it again, a sound from behind me, not a creak, not a rustle. Breathing. I didn't stop to check. I bolted for the front door, nearly tripping over myself in my rush to get out. I stumbled down the steps, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my truck keys. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights illuminated the cabin one last time before I reversed down the path, kicking up dirt as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I didn't look back. I called my boss as soon as I had service again, told him the place was unstable, unsafe, that they should forget about the property. He didn't argue. He just said, understood, like he already knew, like he had expected it. I never went back, and I never asked why. I had been looking for a place to get away from everything for a while. The kind of place where the world didn't feel so loud, where I could go for days without seeing another person. I wasn't the kind of guy who craved social interaction anymore. At 39, I had burned out from the constant cycle of work, bills, and responsibility. My divorce 2 years ago had stripped me of everything I thought I had. My home, my savings, and worst of all, my time with my son. That's why when I found the old cabin listing, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't much, just a simple one-room place in the mountains of New Mexico, deep in the Carson National Forest. The land was cheap, mostly because it was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest real town was an hour away, and the last stretch of the road leading up to it wasn't even paved. The seller had described it as a peaceful retreat, and at that moment in my life, that was exactly what I wanted. So I bought it. It was a risk, I knew that, but the idea of having something of my own again, something no one could take from me, felt too good to pass up. The first time I drove out there, I understood why the price had been so low. The cabin sat on a small clearing at the base of a thick ridge, surrounded by dense pine and juniper trees. The only way in was a dirt path that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The structure itself was old, but sturdy. The roof looked solid, and the walls didn't have any obvious rot. There was no electricity, no plumbing, but that didn't matter to me. I had spent enough time camping to know how to live off-grid for a while. I spent the first few weeks making the place livable. I brought in a wood stove, patched up some of the worst parts of the walls, and set up a rain collection system so I wouldn't have to haul water in from town every week. It was slow work, but it was satisfying. The first sign that something wasn't right came about a month in. I had been out in town getting supplies, and when I got back, I noticed something strange. The padlock on the shed behind the cabin was unlatched. At first, I thought I had forgotten to lock it, but I knew I hadn't. I had made it a habit to check everything before leaving. The shed wasn't much, just a small wooden structure that came with the property, filled with rusted tools and old junk left behind by the previous owner. Nothing valuable, nothing worth stealing. But still, the fact that it had been open stuck with me. That night, I lay awake in my cot, listening. The forest had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It all sounded like something moving just outside. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I kept the rifle next to my bed anyway. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints in the dirt outside the shed. I wasn't alone out there. I spent the day trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a lost hiker had passed through. Maybe some local had been checking out the property out of curiosity. But there was something about the prints that didn't sit right. They weren't scattered like someone walking aimlessly. They were deliberate, circling the cabin, stopping by the windows, standing at the front door. Whoever it was, they had been watching me. I started being more careful after that. I kept my rifle loaded and made sure to lock everything up tight before dark. A few days passed without incident, and I started to think maybe it had just been a one-time thing. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the outside of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, a long, dragging sound, like nails against wood. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for my rifle. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. I strained my ears, listening. The scraping stopped. Then, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps paused right outside the door. Whoever was out there was just standing there, listening. I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps retreated. I heard them move off into the woods, fading into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the wooden walls of the cabin. Long, jagged marks like someone had run a knife or some kind of tool across the surface. I needed to leave. I packed up my essentials and loaded them into my truck. But when I went to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead. That was when I noticed the hood was slightly open. Someone had tampered with it. I was stuck. The only way out now was on foot. I could hike back to the main road, but it would take hours, and I had no idea if whoever had been messing with me was still out there. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin, boarding up the windows and barricading the door. When night fell, I sat in the dark, rifle in hand, waiting. The noises started just after midnight. First, the sound of movement in the trees. Then, the familiar, slow scraping against the walls. Then, something new. A soft, deliberate tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed completely still. The tapping stopped. Then, a long, slow exhale right outside the glass. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, footsteps again, retreating into the woods. The sun couldn't come fast enough. By morning, I made my decision. I wasn't spending another night there. I grabbed my pack, my rifle, and set out on foot, following the overgrown trail that led back to the main road. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. 2 hours later, I made it to the road. I walked until I found a passing trucker who was willing to give me a ride into town. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the land for half of what I had paid, and I didn't care. Whatever was out there, whoever had been watching me, it wasn't worth finding out. Some places aren't meant to be lived in, and some people aren't meant to be alone. I never planned to stay in the cabin for long. It was supposed to be a quick weekend away. Just me, the quiet woods, and the simple pleasure of being alone. No work, no emails, no phone calls. Just peace. The cabin belonged to an old friend of mine, someone I hadn't seen in years. He told me it was barely used, just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, waiting for someone to appreciate it. It sounded perfect. I packed light, some food, a sleeping bag, and a rifle just in case. The place was deep in the woods, past an old dirt road that barely looked drivable. I had to park my truck half a mile away and hike the rest of the distance. The moment I stepped onto the property, I felt the silence pressing in. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I had been hoping for. It was something else, too still, too empty. The cabin was small, made of old wood that had darkened over the years. It had one door, 2 small windows, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The forest around it was thick, the trees packed so closely together that the sky barely peeked through. Inside, it was basic: 1 room, a fireplace, a small wooden table, and a bed in the corner with a thin mattress. Dust coated everything. It was clear no one had stayed here for a long time. I didn't mind. I wasn't here for luxury. I set up my things, lit a fire, and made a quick meal. The woods outside were quiet. No animal sounds, no wind through the trees, just silence. After a while, I stopped noticing it. I had been driving for hours and was too tired to overthink things. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once when I thought I heard something outside, just a faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the leaves. But when I sat up and listened, everything was quiet again, probably an animal. The next morning, I went outside to gather some firewood. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I stared at them for a long time. They were deep, like someone had been standing there for a while. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I tried to convince myself they had been there before I arrived, that maybe my friend had come by recently. But something about them made me uneasy. I shook it off, spent the rest of the day chopping wood, cooking, and reading. By the time the sun went down, I had almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. That night, I woke up again. It was the same sound, soft footsteps outside. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed my rifle and sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened for what felt like an hour, but everything was silent. Eventually, I laid back down. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I checked outside. The footprints were back, and this time they were closer to the cabin. Someone had been standing right outside my window. I felt my stomach drop. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone was out here, watching me, I considered packing up and leaving, but my truck was parked half a mile away. If someone was in the woods, they could easily cut me off before I got to it. I decided to wait until daylight, then hike back as quickly as I could. I spent the whole day on edge, jumping at every little sound. The woods felt different now. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. That night, I barely let the fire die down. I sat up, rifle in hand, waiting. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. The door handle rattled. My blood went cold. I aimed my rifle at the door, my hands sweating. The handle moved again, slowly, like someone was testing it. I didn't move. Then silence. For hours I sat there waiting, but nothing happened. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was getting out of there. I packed my things, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The air was cold, the trees still. The footprints were back, but now they circled the cabin. Someone had been walking around all night. I forced myself to move, walking quickly toward my truck. The whole time I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. Then I saw it. A man standing between the trees. He was half hidden in the shadows, wearing dark clothes, his face obscured. He didn't move. He just stood there watching me. I didn't stop. I kept walking, faster now, my pulse hammering. He didn't follow. I reached my truck, threw my gear inside, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back. The man was still standing there, in the same spot, watching me leave. I never went back. I never asked my friend about the cabin. I didn't want to know, because I knew one thing for sure. Whoever he was, he had been waiting for me. I never liked going out into the woods, but my cousin Mark always did. He was the kind of guy who felt at home away from the city, always talking about the fresh air, the quiet, and how he could clear his mind out there. I never really saw the appeal, but when he invited me to his cabin for a weekend, I figured I'd give it a try. I had nothing going on that weekend anyway, and he'd been asking me for years. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was an old family property, something his dad had built back in the 80s when he wanted a place to get away. Mark had been maintaining it ever since his dad passed, fixing things up little by little. It was deep in the woods, miles away from any town. No neighbors, no traffic, no noise except for the wind and the sounds of animals at night. We drove up there late on a Friday. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, and the deeper we got into the forest, the less comfortable I felt. The trees seemed thicker than they should be, almost pressing in on us. The headlights of the truck barely cut through the darkness. The rain had made the road slick, and I could feel the tires slipping at times. When we got there, the cabin looked about as I expected, old but solid. A wooden structure with a small porch, a metal roof, and a stone chimney. Mark had installed some solar panels, so at least we had electricity, but there was no running water. We had to pump it from a well out back. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A wood stove, a small kitchen area, a couch, and a couple of chairs. A bedroom off to the side. The air inside smelled like pine and old wood. Mark had already stocked up on firewood, and after a quick look around, I figured it wasn't so bad. The first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was fine, but I wasn't used to the silence. No cars, no city sounds. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. A few times, I thought I heard something outside, like movement, but I told myself it was just an animal. There were plenty of those out here. The next day, we spent most of the morning hiking. Mark knew the trails like the back of his hand. He pointed out different plants, talked about deer tracks, and even showed me an old hunting blind his dad had built years ago. I had to admit the air was fresh, and for a while I actually felt good being out there. But as the sun started to go down, something changed. We were heading back to the cabin when I noticed it first. A sound. Not an animal, not the wind. Something else. Like footsteps. But not just behind us, around us. I didn't say anything at first. I figured maybe I was just imagining it. The woods played tricks on people, especially those who weren't used to them. But after a few minutes, Mark slowed down. He must have heard it too. We didn't stop, just walked a little faster. The sound kept up with us. At one point, Mark turned his head slightly, like he was listening closely. When we reached the cabin, we went inside and locked the door. Neither of us said anything. It was like an unspoken agreement not to talk about it. He started up the wood stove, and I sat down, pretending to relax. But I kept thinking about what I'd heard. Later that night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the silence that got me. It was a sound. Clear, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Right outside the cabin. Slow. Heavy. Not an animal. I lay there, listening, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped for a while, then started again, moving around the cabin. I wanted to believe it was Mark, but I knew it wasn't. I could hear him breathing in the other room. Then something even worse happened. The sound of the front door handle moving. Someone was trying to get in. I stayed perfectly still, hoping whoever was out there would just leave. But they didn't. I heard them move around again to the back of the cabin. Mark's voice came from the other room, low and steady. "Did you hear that?" I didn't answer. We both knew the answer. For hours, we stayed in silence, listening. The sounds came and went. Sometimes there was nothing, just silence so deep it almost hurt my ears. Then there would be movement again, slow, careful, like someone was watching the cabin, waiting. By morning, it was quiet again, but neither of us had slept. Mark went outside first, rifle in hand. I followed, looking around. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They led from the treeline to the cabin and back again. But whoever it was hadn't left in a hurry. They had taken their time. We packed up right then and there. Neither of us said much, but we both knew we weren't staying another night. The drive back to town felt longer than before. Neither of us talked about what had happened. Not that day, not the week after, not ever. Mark still owns the cabin, but he doesn't go out there much anymore. And I never went back. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we weren't alone. And whoever it was, they didn't mean well. It was the kind of place you'd only see if you were lost. Hidden deep in the woods, past an old dirt road no one used anymore, the graveyard cabin stood at the edge of a forgotten burial ground. I wouldn't have been there if I had a choice, but life doesn't always give you one. It started with my uncle's death. I hadn't seen him in years, not since I was a kid, but when I got a letter saying he'd left me his cabin, I figured I should at least see what it was before selling it. I didn't have much keeping me in the city. A job I hated, a tiny apartment with noisy neighbors, nothing that mattered. So I packed my things and drove out, thinking maybe I'd spend a few nights there, clear my head, and then get rid of the place. The drive took longer than expected. The roads got worse the farther I went, turning from pavement to gravel to dirt. My phone lost signal miles before I reached the cabin, which didn't surprise me. I had printed a map, just in case, but the closer I got, the less sure I was that I wanted to be there. The first thing I saw was the graveyard. It wasn't big, just a few dozen headstones, some so worn down I could barely read them. A few were broken, others leaned like they might fall over at any second. The whole place looked forgotten. Overgrown weeds wrapped around the graves, and the trees hung low, casting long shadows even in the middle of the day. Then I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I imagined. A single-story wooden structure with a sagging porch and a roof that looked like it could use some work. The windows were dirty, but the door was intact, and the lock worked. I stepped inside and was hit by the smell of dust and old wood. The place was empty except for some basic furniture. A small bed, a table, a couple of chairs. I checked every corner just to be sure I was alone. The cabin was simple. One main room, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom in the back. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a fireplace and an old oil lamp on the table. I should have left. Something about the place felt off. Not haunted, not supernatural, just wrong. But I told myself it was just the isolation, the silence. I wasn't used to being so far from everything. I spent the first night lying awake, listening to the wind push against the trees. Every sound was louder than it should have been. The creak of the old wooden walls, the rustling leaves, even my own breathing. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. The second night, I noticed something strange. I had left my boots by the door before bed, but when I woke up, they were moved. Not by much, just a few inches to the left. I thought maybe I had kicked them in my sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I found the footprints. They were just outside the cabin, near the graveyard. Deep, heavy prints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were bigger, and there were more than one set. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, oil lamp flickering, watching the tree line. Nothing moved, but I knew someone had been there. By the third day, I decided I had to leave, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but it wouldn't catch. I checked under the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what was wrong. That night, I locked the door and pushed the table against it. I kept the oil lamp burning, even though I knew it wouldn't last forever. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, crunching over the dead leaves. Then they stopped, right outside the door. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled. Whoever was out there didn't knock. They didn't say anything. They just stood there, trying the door, testing it. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I finally dared to move the table and open the door, there was nothing there. Just the same deep footprints in the dirt, leading back into the woods. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I packed what little I had, grabbed my keys, and tried the truck again. It started on the first try, like nothing had been wrong with it. I didn't look back as I drove away. I never went back. I sold the cabin for whatever I could get. Never even met the buyer. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places should just be left alone. It had been years since I last drove through that stretch of road. I never had a reason to, and I never wanted one. But life has a strange way of forcing you into places you swore you'd never go again. That night, the highway was flooded with rain, and visibility was barely more than a few feet. My original route was blocked because of an accident, and my only other option was to take the back roads. I should have turned around. I should have found another way, but instead, I drove straight into the past. The road was just like I remembered, narrow, winding, cutting through miles of dense trees. There were no streetlights out here, just the dull glow of my headlights bouncing off the rain-soaked pavement. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and every few minutes, I had to lean forward, squinting through the windshield just to stay on the road. I knew exactly where I was. A few more turns and I'd be passing the cabin. The one my ex-wife and I had bought together. The one we used to spend weekends in. The one I hadn't seen since the divorce. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. When I rounded the bend, my headlights caught the edge of the cabin's front porch. For a split second, I considered speeding up, just blowing past it without a second glance. But then something made me slow down. Something was off. The porch light was on, I frowned. As far as I knew, no one lived there anymore. After the divorce, she moved out of state, and last I heard, the place had been abandoned. Overgrown, falling apart. But that light, it shouldn't have been on. I eased off the gas, letting the truck roll forward at a crawl. My hands were tight on the wheel, my breath shallow. The rain hammered against the roof, filling the cab with a steady, deafening rhythm. I kept my eyes on the cabin. The door was closed. The windows were dark, but the porch light cast a weak, yellow glow over the wooden steps, highlighting something that sent a chill down my spine. There were fresh footprints leading up to the door. I let the truck roll past a little farther, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe someone had bought the place. Maybe squatters had moved in. Maybe a shadow moved. I slammed the brakes. The figure stood near the side of the cabin, just past the reach of the porch light. I could barely make out the shape. A person, tall, motionless, half hidden in the darkness. I didn't move. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Or at least I stared. I couldn't see their face. Couldn't even tell if they were facing me at all. They just stood there, unmoving, as the rain poured down. Something about the way they stood made my stomach twist. I should have driven away. I should have left that place in my rearview mirror and never looked back. But something about it pulled at me. Some part of me needed to know who it was, why they were there. I put the truck in reverse, backing up just enough so that my headlights lit up the side of the cabin. The figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked around, scanning the trees, the porch, the driveway. Nothing. Just the rain and the night. I should have left. But then I saw the door. It was open. I knew for a fact that it had been closed when I passed by. But now it was cracked open just enough to show the darkness inside. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Something told me to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But my body wasn't listening. I opened the door, stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me like a slap, soaking through my clothes instantly. My boots crunched against the wet gravel as I walked toward the cabin. The porch creaked under my weight. I reached for the door, hesitating just before touching it. A sound, a shuffling noise from inside. I felt my chest tighten. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But instead, I pushed the door open. Darkness. The inside of the cabin smelled damp, like old wood and rot. The furniture was still there, dusty, covered in cobwebs. The couch we used to sit on, the old wooden table we ate dinner at. Everything was exactly the way we had left it, except now it felt wrong. I took a step inside, my boots echoing against the wooden floor. The sound felt too loud, too out of place. I listened, waiting, barely breathing. Nothing, just the sound of rain dripping through a hole in the roof. I stepped farther in. The floor groaned under my weight. And then footsteps, not mine. I turned so fast I nearly slipped. The sound had come from the back room. I knew that room. It used to be our bedroom. The door was slightly open, a sliver of darkness. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move. My boots were heavy, my breaths uneven. I reached out, pushed the door open. Empty. The window was open, rain blowing in. The curtains fluttered in the wind, casting shifting shadows across the floor. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had they gone out the window? Had they been standing in this very room, watching me as I walked through the front door? A noise behind me. I spun around. The front door. It was closed. I had left it open. My stomach dropped. Something was in here with me. I didn't think. I just moved. I ran through the cabin, shoving the door open with both hands. The rain hit me like ice, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to the truck, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the rain. And then I saw them, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, I slammed my foot on the gas, tires kicking up gravel as I tore down the road. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were still there. I drove until I hit the main road, until the rain began to let up and the trees thinned out, until the cabin was nothing but a memory. I never went back. I don't know who was there that night. I don't know if it was someone squatting in the abandoned house, or if it was something worse. All I know is that I was not alone, and whoever was there, they were expecting me. I had taken a week off from work, needing to get away from everything. London was suffocating me. The noise, the crowds, the feeling of being surrounded but completely alone. I wanted silence, proper silence, not the kind where you can still hear the hum of traffic in the distance. I found a cabin for rent online, deep in the countryside of Northumberland. It was isolated, miles away from the nearest village, tucked into the woods at the end of a dirt track. The pictures showed a sturdy little wooden cabin with a small porch, a single chimney poking up from the roof, and a thick tree line surrounding it. It looked perfect. The drive out there took most of the afternoon. The roads got narrower the further I went, the hedgerows closing in until they were brushing the sides of my car. The last stretch was a rough track through the woods, the trees growing thick and dark on either side. My tires crunched over gravel as I pulled up to the cabin. It looked just like the pictures. Small but well kept, a stack of firewood piled up against one side, a few steps leading up to the porch. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the rustling of the trees in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single open-plan room with a kitchen along one wall, a wood-burning stove, a sofa, and a small table. A narrow door led to the bedroom, and beyond that was the bathroom. The windows were small, framed by thick wooden shutters. It smelled like wood and dust, like no one had been inside for a while. I unpacked my things, made a cup of tea, and sat on the porch as the sun set behind the trees. The woods stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and still. I didn't feel nervous, just aware of how alone I was. That was the whole point, though. I had come here to be alone. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, read for a while, then went to bed early. The silence was almost too much at first, pressing in on me, but I must have been more exhausted than I realized because I fell asleep quickly. The second day, I explored the woods. There was an old path leading away from the cabin, overgrown but still visible, winding deeper into the trees. I followed it for an hour, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under low-hanging limbs. I didn't see another soul. No houses, no sign of anyone passing through. Just endless trees and the occasional burst of birdsong. That evening, as I was making dinner, I had the sudden feeling that I wasn't alone. It was strange, like a prickle on the back of my neck. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty cabin. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind adjusting to the quiet after so long in the city. I ate my meal, sat by the fire, and tried to relax. I went to bed a little after 10. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the branches against the roof. I lay in the dark, listening. That's when I heard it. A sound outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I stopped breathing. My body locked up, every muscle rigid. The sound continued. One step, then another. A soft creak of wood under weight. I forced myself to sit up, heart hammering. The shutters were closed, but I felt exposed, like whoever was outside could see straight through the walls. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like forever, ears straining. The wind hissed through the trees, but nothing else. No footsteps, no movement. After a long time, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The old wood of the porch shifting in the wind, maybe. That was all. Eventually, I lay back down, forcing myself to relax. Sleep took a long time to come. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were footprints, bare footprints, pressed into the thin layer of dirt and damp leaves. They led from the treeline to the cabin and stopped right outside the door. I stood there, staring. My stomach felt hollow. Someone had been here. I told myself it was a local, someone passing through. Maybe a hiker, someone curious about the cabin. But that didn't explain why they had been barefoot, or why they had stood so still, so silently, right outside my door. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had paid for the whole week. I had come out here to get away, and I wasn't gonna let some weirdo ruin that. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I closed the shutters tight. I sat up late by the fire, listening. Nothing. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound. Tapping. A slow, rhythmic tapping on the window. I sat up, throat dry. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. The tapping continued, steady, insistent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then something shifted outside. A shadow against the slats of the shutters. Someone was standing there, right outside the window. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, the shadow moved away. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the window. More footprints leading away into the trees. I had had enough. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and left. I didn't care about the refund. I just wanted to be gone. As I drove back down the track, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a woman. She was barefoot, dressed in something pale and tattered. Her skin was dirty, her hair hanging in loose, tangled strands. She was watching me. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. I don't know who she was. I don't know why she was there, why she had stood outside my cabin, tapping on the window in the middle of the night. I don't want to know. I just know I will never go back to that place. Never again. I was never the kind of person to believe in legends. I spent my whole life outdoors, hunting, hiking, camping in places most people wouldn't step foot in. I trusted my gut, trusted my gun, and never let stories of strange creatures keep me from doing what I loved. That was before the winter of 2015, before I took a trip into the mountains and found a cabin that should have been empty. I had planned the trip for months. I needed time away, time to clear my head after everything that had happened that year. My dad had passed in the spring, and my work had been running me into the ground. I wasn't sleeping well, wasn't thinking straight, so I figured a week alone in the mountains would fix things. I knew the area well. It was in the Wyoming backcountry, miles away from anything. I had been there before, but never this deep into the valley. I had my rifle, my pack, enough food for a week, and a map showing a small, abandoned hunting cabin I could use for shelter. The drive took most of the day. I parked my truck near a dirt trail that led into the valley, packed my gear, and hiked in. Snow had started to fall by the time I reached the cabin. It was old, built in the early 1900s, the kind of place you'd expect a trapper to use. One window was cracked, the door was hanging loose, but it was solid. It would keep the cold out. I went inside and set up my gear. There was an old wood stove, a bunk in the corner, and a few shelves with rusted cans and a mouse-chewed blanket. The wind howled outside, and I was grateful for the walls. That first night, I slept hard. The kind of sleep that only comes when you've been hiking in cold air all day. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, something woke me up. A sound. It was faint, barely there, but enough to pull me from my sleep. Scratching. It came from the outside of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like something was dragging its nails against the wood. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The wind had died down, and in the stillness, the noise was clear. Long, slow scratches against the cabin walls. I grabbed my rifle and stood up. My breath came in short, sharp bursts in the cold air. The scratching stopped. I waited. Nothing. After a long time, I convinced myself it had been a tree branch moving in the wind, even though I knew there were no trees close enough to touch the walls. I forced myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The snow was fresh, untouched, except for one thing: tracks. They led from the treeline to the side of the cabin, right where I had heard the scratching. At first, I thought they were from a coyote or a wolf, but as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. They were wrong. The shape was off, almost human, but the stride was too long, the gait too uneven. Some prints were deep, as if whatever made them had landed hard, while others barely pressed into the snow. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. I followed the tracks to the edge of the woods, but they just stopped. No signs of turning back, no sign of anything. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. The rest of the day, I tried to push it from my mind. I went out to hunt, climbed up a ridge, spent hours in the snow, but something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling branches, nothing. Just silence. That night, I locked the cabin door. I kept my rifle close. Sleep was uneasy. Sometime after midnight, the noise started again. It wasn't scratching this time. It was knocking. Slow, heavy knocks on the cabin door. I sat up, rifle in hand, staring at the door. My breath fogged in the air. The knocking came again. Steady, rhythmic. I stayed still. Another knock, then another, then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my rifle, heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was a person, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Morning came slow. When the first light hit, I forced myself outside. I checked the ground, my stomach tightening when I saw the same tracks leading up to the door, and something else. A shape, a long, dark smudge in the snow, like something had been lying there, waiting. I should have left then, should have packed my gear and hiked out. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me. That was my mistake. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat awake with my rifle, waiting. At some point, the knocking started again. Slow, deliberate. Then it moved. From the door to the wall. From the wall to the window. Then I heard something worse. Breathing. Long, slow breaths just outside the cabin. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Then a whisper. Not words, just a sound. Low, crooked, almost human. My blood turned to ice. Then came the worst part. Spoke my name. Not in a voice I recognized. Not in any voice a person should have. It was stretched, broken, like someone was trying to form the words but didn't know how. I stayed frozen. The voice whispered again, longer this time. Then it started to scratch at the door. I don't remember much after that. Just sitting there, staring at the door, my mind running through every possibility, every explanation. Then, just before dawn, the noises stopped. When daylight came, I made my decision. I packed my gear, stepped outside, and didn't look back. The tracks were everywhere, circling the cabin, leading in and out of the woods. But what made my skin crawl was the last set of tracks. They weren't human. They weren't animal. They looked like both, and they led away from the cabin into the trees. I hiked out that day, moving fast, not stopping. When I reached my truck, I felt something lift, like I had stepped out of something I wasn't supposed to be in. I never went back. A few weeks later, I told a friend about it, someone who knew the area well. He just nodded, face pale. "You were lucky," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. And to this day, I never went back to that valley. I never will. And I'll never forget the way it whispered my name. I never thought much about fear until I spent that week alone in the cabin. Before that, fear was an abstract thing, something that belonged in the minds of others, something I could dismiss as paranoia or overreaction. I wish I could go back to that way of thinking, because now, after what happened, I know fear in a way I never did before. A real, tangible thing that lingers even after the danger has passed. It was the fall of 2016. I had just turned 34, and I needed a break from life. Work was getting overwhelming, and I had been dealing with a bad breakup that left me feeling like I had no real direction. My uncle owned an old hunting cabin out in the Oregon wilderness, miles from the nearest town. He rarely used it, and when I asked if I could stay there for a week, he didn't hesitate to hand me the keys. "Good place to clear your head," he had said. Looking back, I should have read between the lines. I packed light, just enough food, water, and supplies to last the week. I brought my hunting rifle, a couple of good knives, and some firewood in case the stockpile at the cabin was low. The drive was long, the last hour spent on a dirt road that twisted through thick pines, the kind of place where radio signals fade and the world feels distant. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The place was old but sturdy. A single-room structure with a loft for sleeping, a wood stove, and a porch that overlooked a small clearing. Behind it was a shed, likely filled with rusting tools and forgotten supplies. The nearest neighbor was at least 10 miles away, and the isolation was exactly what I had wanted. The first night passed quietly. I made a fire, cooked some beans, and sat outside, listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted, crickets chirped, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled. I felt at peace, like I had finally escaped the weight of my life. I went to bed early, the fire crackling softly as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I explored the area, following an old trail that led deeper into the woods. I found an abandoned fire pit, probably used by hunters, and a small creek with clear water. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, where the world outside didn't matter. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a feeling, a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. That night, the feeling grew stronger. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Something was moving just beyond the tree line. I held still, my rifle resting on my lap. My breath was slow, controlled. The sound stopped, and I stared into the dark, trying to make out any movement. Nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but I locked the cabin door before I went to sleep. The third day, I went hunting. I followed a trail deeper into the woods, rifle in hand, searching for game. But as I moved through the trees, I kept getting this feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I would stop and listen, but the only sound was the wind through the branches. Still, my gut told me something wasn't right. I caught a rabbit late in the afternoon, cleaned it, and set it over the fire that evening. As the meat cooked, I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see something staring back at me. The unease was growing, pressing against me like a weight on my chest. Then I saw it, a shape in the trees just at the edge of the firelight. Tall, motionless, watching. My stomach turned to ice. I grabbed my rifle, heart pounding, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the fear, the deep, primal certainty that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. I kept my rifle close, my ears straining for any sign of movement. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. My blood went cold. I sat up slowly, reaching for my rifle. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then, a soft tap against the wooden door. Not knocking, just tapping. I stayed perfectly still. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move. Another tap, and then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't know. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, and I found the courage to move. Rifle in hand, I inched toward the door and yanked it open. Nothing, just the empty porch, the clearing bathed in early morning light. But then I saw it, the footprints, human footprints, pressed into the dirt, leading from the tree line to my porch, and leading away. I didn't wait. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and left. I didn't care about the food I left behind, the firewood stacked against the shed. I drove faster than I should have, barely slowing for the rough dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, until I saw another car, another person. I never told my uncle what happened. When he asked why I left early, I just said I wasn't feeling well. He never questioned it. Maybe he knew. Maybe that's why he never went there himself. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know this. I wasn't alone. And I never will be, not really, because some things stay with you long after you leave the woods behind.